Dr. Elena Morris did not believe in moments that changed everything, at least not anymore. Because life had taught her that change usually came quietly and stayed hidden until it was too late to stop it. And that belief stayed with her as she walked through the hospital corridor on a gray afternoon when rain pressed softly against the windows and the building hummed with the tired breath of machines and people, and she held a thin patient file in her hands, barely reading it, thinking only of finishing her shift and going home to an apartment that felt larger and emptier each year. Yet something about this file slowed her steps, not the diagnosis or the history but the way the notes were written, careful, almost hesitant, as if even the doctors before her had not known how to place this patient into neat medical words. And when she reached room 417 she paused for a second, took a breath, and stepped inside expecting nothing more than routine questions and polite distance. But what she found unsettled her in a way she could not explain, because Daniel Reyes was standing by the window instead of lying in bed, his back turned, one hand resting against the glass as he watched the rain fall over the city, and there was a quiet strength in the way he stood, mixed with weariness, like someone who had been fighting a private battle for a long time without asking for help, and when he turned toward her his eyes were calm but alert, curious without being demanding, and he smiled, not wide or dramatic, just enough to show warmth, and said hello as if he had been waiting for her specifically, and Elena felt an unexpected flicker of awareness pass through her, something small but sharp, like a spark brushed too close to dry paper, and she introduced herself, her voice steady from years of practice, and began asking questions, but the conversation did not follow the usual path, because Daniel answered honestly without complaint or exaggeration, spoke of pain as something he lived with rather than something that defined him, and even found space for quiet humor, and Elena caught herself listening not only with her medical focus but with personal interest, noticing the lines near his eyes that suggested laughter had once come easily to him, noticing the careful way he chose words as if he valued them, and as minutes passed she forgot to glance at the clock, forgot the noise outside the room, forgot the safe emotional distance she normally kept, and instead felt drawn into the simple rhythm of his voice, and when she asked about family he hesitated just long enough to reveal an absence, then said he managed on his own, and there was no bitterness in it, only acceptance, which somehow made it heavier, and Elena nodded, making a note she barely read later, because what stayed with her was the look he gave her when she explained the tests they would run, attentive and trusting, as if he believed she would not let him fall, and that trust landed on her with quiet weight, reminding her of promises she once made to herself and broke, promises to care deeply but not personally, promises that had kept her safe since the loss she never spoke of. And when their conversation ended she realized she had stayed longer than planned, and Daniel thanked her not for the treatment but for taking time, and that simple sentence followed her as she left the room, echoing in her thoughts while she moved through the rest of her shift on autopilot, checking charts, giving instructions, speaking when needed, yet part of her mind remained in room 417, replaying the sound of his voice, the calm in his eyes, the feeling that she had stepped into a story already in motion, and later, as evening settled and the hospital lights grew softer, she found herself walking back toward his room under the excuse of checking results that could have waited, and when she saw him sitting on the bed reading an old paperback she felt a strange sense of relief, as if confirming he was still real, still there. And their second conversation was shorter but carried a different tone, less formal, more human, and Daniel spoke about the book, about how stories helped him forget pain for a while. And Elena admitted she used to love reading before life grew busy, and that small confession surprised her, because she rarely shared anything personal with patients, yet it felt natural with him, like breathing without effort. And when she left that time she noticed the quiet tension in her chest, the warning she chose to ignore, because she told herself this was nothing, just empathy, just curiosity. But as night came and she finally drove home through wet streets, she realized she was thinking of Daniel not as a case or a responsibility, but as a person whose presence had stirred something she thought was long buried. And she sat alone in her apartment, the silence louder than usual, and wondered when she had last felt this aware of another human being. And though she tried to push the feeling away, telling herself tomorrow would be different, that she would return to routine, a soft truth settled in her heart, quiet but firm, that this patient had already begun to change something inside her, and she did not yet know whether that change would heal her or break her, only that there was no turning back now. The days after their first meeting moved quickly, Yet each one seemed to circle back to Daniel Reyes in a way Elena did not expect, because no matter how busy the ward became or how many patients needed her attention, she found her thoughts drifting toward room 417, and she told herself it was only because his case was complex, because she cared about doing her job well. But deep down she sensed something else growing, something she had not felt in years. And as Daniel settled into the routine of tests and treatments, Elena became the one who explained each step, her voice calm and clear. And Daniel listened closely, asking thoughtful questions, never demanding more than honesty, and with every conversation their ease with each other deepened, as if familiarity had arrived too fast to be questioned. And soon their talks moved beyond symptoms and schedules into quieter territory, like the cities Daniel once lived in before illness slowed him down, the small jobs he took, the nights he spent listening to music when sleep would not come. And Elena shared careful pieces of herself in return, mentioning long hours at medical school, the sacrifices she made without naming the cost. And Daniel noticed her tired eyes and told her she worked too hard, a simple comment that made her laugh before she could stop herself. And that laughter surprised her more than anything, because it felt real and light, and she realized how rare that had become. And as weeks passed, the hospital seemed to shrink around them, the hallway outside his room becoming a familiar path she walked even when there was no clear reason. And nurses teased her gently about having a favorite patient, and she brushed it off, smiling but uneasy, because she knew she was crossing an invisible line even if she had not yet stepped fully over it. And one afternoon, when Daniel returned from a painful procedure, Elena stayed longer than necessary, sitting in the chair beside his bed as he rested. And in the quiet he spoke about fear in a low voice, about how pain wore down not just the body but hope. And Elena listened without interrupting, feeling the weight of his honesty. And when he asked her if she ever felt afraid, she hesitated, then admitted that she feared becoming numb, feared waking up one day and realizing she had stopped caring. And Daniel looked at her with a gentleness that made her chest tighten, and said he did not think she could ever be numb, because people like her felt too deeply. And that simple observation settled between them like a shared secret. And from that moment the air changed, becoming heavier with things unsaid. And Elena began to notice the way Daniel watched her when she spoke, attentive and warm, and she became aware of her own reactions, the way her pulse quickened when he smiled, the way she felt disappointment on days she could not visit, and she reminded herself again and again of the rules, of the reasons such connections were dangerous. Yet reminders lost their strength as the days continued, and one evening after most patients had fallen asleep, Elena found Daniel awake, staring at the ceiling, and she asked what kept him up, and he confessed that nights were the hardest, because they left too much room for memory. And he spoke of a woman he once loved, how illness pulled them apart slowly, not through anger but exhaustion. And Elena felt an unexpected ache of recognition, because she too carried a quiet history of love that did not survive the demands of her career. And though neither of them said it directly, there was a shared understanding in that moment, a sense of two lives shaped by loss in different ways. And Daniel told her he sometimes wondered if he had already lived the best part of his life, and Elena responded without thinking, telling him his story was not over. And when he asked how she could be so sure, she held his gaze and said some chapters came later than we expect. And the look in his eyes then was filled with something close to hope, and that hope frightened her more than his pain ever could, because it tied her to him emotionally in a way she could no longer deny. And from that night on, Elena felt the shift clearly, knowing she was no longer just a doctor checking in on a patient but a woman standing at the edge of something complicated and fragile. And she tried to pull back, limiting visits, keeping conversations brief, but distance only sharpened her awareness. And when days passed without seeing him she felt restless and distracted. And when she returned and saw relief in his face she felt both comfort and guilt. And the tension reached a quiet peak on an afternoon when Daniel received discouraging test results, and his calm cracked just enough to reveal fear. And Elena sat with him, choosing presence over protocol, and he admitted he was scared of being forgotten, of passing through life without leaving a mark. And something in Elena broke open at those words, because she recognized that fear as her own, and she told him he mattered, that his life had meaning, and she meant it not as reassurance but as truth. And the room filled with silence thick with emotion, and Daniel looked at her as if he wanted to say more but chose not to, respecting a boundary neither of them named. And when Elena finally stood to leave, her heart heavy and full at once. She understood that whatever this connection was, it could not remain harmless for long, and as she walked down the hallway, the hospital lights blurring slightly in her vision, she knew with certainty that she was already changed, standing in the middle of a story she could no longer control, unsure of where it would lead or how much it would cost her to keep going. The shift came without warning, like a sudden change in weather that darkened the sky before anyone had time to prepare, and Elena felt it the moment she read Daniel's new test results, because the numbers did not match the calm progress she had hoped for, and her chest tightened as she walked faster than usual toward his room, her steps sharp and focused, pushing aside the quiet fear rising in her. And when she entered, Daniel looked at her and knew instantly that something was wrong, not because she said anything yet, but because she paused for half a second too long before speaking, and though her voice stayed steady as she explained the situation, he heard the concern underneath, and for the first time since she met him, Daniel looked truly shaken, not panicked, but aware in a deeper way, as if the future he had been holding at arm's length suddenly stepped closer, and the days that followed blurred into a fast rhythm of scans, consultations, late-night reviews, and Elena threw herself into the work with a focus that surprised even her colleagues, arriving early, leaving late, skipping meals without noticing, because helping Daniel was no longer just about professional duty, it was personal, even if she never said it aloud. And Daniel noticed her effort, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she leaned against the counter for a brief second when she thought no one was watching, and one afternoon he asked her why she cared so much, and the question caught her off guard, because the answer lived too close to the truth, and she replied simply that she did not give up on people easily, and Daniel smiled faintly, as if that answer was enough for now, and as his condition became more uncertain, their conversations grew deeper, stripped of small talk, filled instead with honesty, and Daniel spoke about his childhood, growing up learning to be independent too early, about dreams he postponed again and again until they quietly faded, and Elena listened with a heavy heart, realizing how much life he had lived within limits, and in return she shared pieces of herself she had never voiced at work, telling him about the relationship she lost years ago because she chose her career, how love slowly turned into distance, and how she convinced herself it was the right choice until loneliness proved otherwise, and Daniel listened carefully, never interrupting, and told her that sometimes survival required sacrifice, but sometimes it only felt like survival because we were afraid to want more, and his words stayed with her long after she left the room, echoing in her mind during sleepless nights, and the hospital at night felt different now, quieter, heavier, and Elena found herself standing outside Daniel's room more than once, hesitating before entering, afraid of how much comfort she sought there herself, and one night when his pain spiked suddenly, she stayed by his side as nurses adjusted treatment, watching his face tighten and relax in waves, and when the worst passed he looked exhausted but calm, and he thanked her softly for staying, and Elena felt a pull so strong it frightened her, because she wanted to reach for his hand, not as a doctor, but as someone who did not want him to feel alone, and she kept her hands still, clenched lightly together, reminding herself of the line she could not cross, and Daniel seemed to understand, because he did not ask for more, but his eyes lingered on her face with quiet intensity, and in that silence something unspoken settled between them, an awareness that both of them were standing on the edge of something fragile, and as days passed, Elena began to sense that time itself was changing shape, stretching and tightening unpredictably because progress came slowly and setbacks came fast, and every update felt like a step forward or a step toward loss, and during one late conversation Daniel asked her a question that stopped her breath, asking if she believed some people entered our lives not to stay, but to remind us of who we are, and Elena felt tears threaten for the first time in years, because the answer was already clear, and she told him she believed that deeply, and he nodded, as if relieved to hear it, and then asked her to promise something, to not close herself off again no matter what happened next, and she wanted to promise, truly wanted to, but fear held her back, fear of loss, fear of regret, fear of loving too late or losing too soon, and she told him she would try, and that was the most honest answer she could give, and shortly after that conversation Daniel's condition reached a critical point that demanded immediate decisions, and Elena stood in meetings, advocating for aggressive treatment, her voice firm even when doubt filled the room, and when the decision was made she went straight to Daniel, explaining the risks and hopes with clear words, and Daniel listened quietly before agreeing, trusting her judgment fully, and that trust weighed heavily on her as she watched him prepared for the procedure, her heart pounding beneath her calm expression, and as he was taken away he looked back at her, offering a small steady smile that felt like a goodbye and a promise at the same time. And Elena stood there long after he was gone, feeling the emptiness of the hallway close in around her, realizing that no matter the outcome, she could never return to the woman she was before she met him. Because somewhere between fear and hope, between duty and desire, Daniel had changed her, and now all she could do was wait, carrying the quiet truth that this connection, whatever its ending, had already reshaped her life in ways she could not undo. Morning arrived slowly, filtered through pale light and the low hum of machines, and Elena stood outside the recovery room with hands folded tight, her body still, her mind racing, because the procedure had ended hours ago yet time felt suspended, stretched thin by fear and hope tangled together. And when the surgeon finally stepped out and told her Daniel had survived, that the outcome was uncertain but stable, relief hit her so hard she had to steady herself against the wall, realizing only then how deeply she had prepared for the possibility of loss. And she entered Daniel's room, quietly, finding him pale but breathing, eyes closed. And in that stillness she felt a wave of gratitude so strong it nearly hurt. And over the following days Daniel slowly returned to awareness, weak but present, his first words simple and dry-humored, asking if she had finally learned to sleep. And Elena laughed softly, the sound breaking something open inside her, because she had not realized how much tension she had been carrying until that moment. And recovery was slow but real, each small improvement a victory that moved things forward at a quick emotional pace even if the body lagged behind. And as Daniel regained strength their conversations changed again, becoming gentler, filled with reflection rather than urgency, and he spoke about how close he felt to the edge, about the strange clarity that came with facing uncertainty. And Elena listened with full attention, knowing this chapter was nearing its end in ways neither of them could change, and soon the doctors decided Daniel could be discharged with ongoing care. A moment that should have felt joyful but instead landed heavy in Elena's chest, because she understood what it meant, that their daily closeness would end, that the fragile space they shared inside hospital walls would not survive outside of them. And on his final day she walked him through paperwork with professional calm. Yet every step felt like walking backward through something she was not ready to leave, and when they stood near the exit, Daniel dressed in ordinary clothes that somehow made him look unfamiliar. He thanked her not with grand words but with quiet sincerity, telling her she gave him courage when he had little left, and Elena replied honestly, telling him he reminded her why she became a doctor in the first place. And there was a pause then, long and meaningful, filled with everything they chose not to say, and Daniel looked at her with warmth and something like acceptance, saying some connections were meant to exist without promises, because they changed us simply by happening. And Elena nodded, feeling tears she did not let fall, because she finally understood that love did not always need to be claimed to be real. And as Daniel walked away, turning once to give a small wave before disappearing into the bright afternoon, Elena stood still, letting the moment settle fully instead of running from it. And the days that followed felt strangely quiet, the hospital unchanged yet different because room 417 no longer held the story that once lived there. And Elena returned to her routine with new awareness, noticing patients more closely, listening more carefully, allowing herself to feel without pulling back. And though Daniel did not return, his presence lingered in the way she approached her work and her life. And months later, on a calm evening, Elena left the hospital at sunset and felt something unfamiliar but welcome, a sense of openness instead of exhaustion. And she realized that the case had not only challenged her skill but reshaped her heart, teaching her that connection, even brief and unspoken, could be powerful enough to heal old wounds. And as she walked forward into the soft evening light, she carried Daniel's memory not as pain but as proof that even unfinished stories could leave us fuller than before. And with that understanding, Elena stepped into the next chapter of her life changed, steady, and quietly hopeful.